Good afternoon, everyone. I'm seeing folks come in, so I'll give you a few more seconds. And Deidre, I see you. Okay, we seem like we have a good quorum. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Unity360 book discussion. I'm Ronnie Bennett, and my pronouns is she, her, and hers. I am the executive director and one of the founding members of South Florida People of Color. Yeah, so let me tell you, I'm very sad today that we lost two civil rights icons yesterday, Reverend C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. I want to say rest in power. May we all continue your legacy of making good trouble. Rest in peace. For those who are not familiar with South Florida People of Color, we are a nonprofit racial healing organization. And our mission is to dismantle racism in all its forms by providing creative programs for socialization, education, and open dialogue across the racial, ethnic, and cultural divide. These interactions breaks down biases and stereotypes and bring people together to build empathetic relationships, which is the powerhouse of dismantling racism on a personal level and eventually on a systemic level. So for those of you that know South Florida People of Color, now you know. Now I would like to kick it over to John Camp for Brockway Memorial Library, so he can say a few words.
Thanks, Ronnie. On behalf of Brockway Memorial Library, I want to thank the South Florida People of Color for its continued work and presence in our community in helping to bridge the racial divide. We appreciate and value our partnership and are grateful for the opportunity to participate in this particularly important and timely discussion. We look forward, of course, to our future events and to our continued partnership. And I will have to say that the first South Florida People of Color, which was then Miami Shores People of Color event that I attended, was a discussion at Brockway Library on Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. And at the time I felt that something profound was happening. So I'm happy and gratified that we continue to work together, and I look forward to our two organizations working together in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. So now I'm going to introduce Tawnicia Rowan, who is a key member of the South Florida People of Color. She is a writer, a professor, and a lifelong student with a special interest in womanist thoughts, with degrees in English literature and composition from Spelman College and Vanderbilt University, and a Master of Divinity from the Interdenominational Theological Center. Tawnicia is the founder of Well Written Words, LLC, an assistant professor of English at Florida Memorial University in Miami Gardens, and a licensed teacher in the Universal Foundation for Better Living. There's a lot more, but I'm going to cut it off there. So without further ado, Tawnicia, is all yours.
Thank you, Ronnie, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for a deep dive into a thought-provoking text, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Before we begin, I have a favor to ask you. I want to propose right up front that we extend our time together by just a little bit and conclude at 2:30 rather than 2 o'clock. So why am I asking this now? Because I already know that the conversation is going to be just that good, and I'm anticipating an abundance of questions and comments, and I'd like to get to as many of those as possible. So if you're good with the idea of extending our time together just a little bit, please type yes in the chat box so that we know you're in. Whether you're on YouTube or Zoom, just say yes. Thank you. So speaking of the chat box, I also want to give you a little heads up about the way that we're going to keep the discussion interactive this afternoon and also relatively on track. Anytime you think of a question that you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to contribute, I'm going to ask that you drop it in the Q&A box if you're joining us on Zoom, or the comments box if you're watching on YouTube Live. We have members of our team monitoring both platforms. And so periodically throughout the presentation, I'll pause and ask them to read some of the questions and comments that you have submitted. So we probably won't be able to get to everything, but we will do our best to make sure that all the ground is covered. So you'll see Jordana, Dedra, Robin, and Ronnie popping in from time to time to pose those questions and comments. And finally, if you're joining us on Zoom and you're having technical difficulty or you want to reach out to a member of our team for something unrelated to the book, please use the raise hand feature, or you can leave a message in the chat box and someone from our team will respond to you. So now that we've got all the housekeeping matters out of the way, let me tell you what is in store for you today. The goal for this afternoon is not to defend the premises of Kendi's book, but rather to ensure that you come away with a clearer picture of what those premises are. And then you can decide for yourself what you want to do with them. But my hope is that you will find them at the very least worthy of further consideration. We'll begin and set the stage for our conversation today by listening to the first 4 minutes of a virtual TED Talk that Ibram Kendi gave last month on June 17th.
So welcome, Ibram, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chloe and Whitney, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. And so a few weeks ago on the same day we learned about the brutal murder of George Floyd, we also learned that a white woman in Central Park who chose not to leash her dog and was told by a Black man nearby that she needed to leash her dog, instead decided to threaten this Black male, instead decided to call the police and claim that her life was being threatened. And of course, when we learned about that through a video, many Americans were outraged. And this woman, Amy Cooper, ended up going on national TV and saying, like countless other Americans have said right after they engaged in a racist act, I am not racist. And I say countless Americans because when you really think about the history of Americans expressing racist ideas, supporting racist policies, you're really talking about a history of people who have claimed they're not racist, because everyone claims that they're not racist, whether we're talking about the Amy Coopers of the world, whether we're talking about Donald Trump, who right after he said that majority Black Baltimore is a rat and rodent-infested mess that no human being would want to live in, and he was challenged as being racist, he said, actually, I'm the least racist person anywhere in the world. And so really the heartbeat of racism itself has always been denial. And the sound of that heartbeat has always been, I'm not racist. And so what I'm trying to do with my work is to really get Americans to eliminate the concept of not racist from their vocabulary and realize we're either being racist or anti-racist. We're either expressing ideas that suggest certain racial groups are better or worse than others, superior or inferior than others. We're either being racist or we're being anti-racist. We're expressing notions that the racial groups are equals, despite any cultural and ethnic differences. We're either supporting policies that are leading to racial inequities and injustice, like we saw in Louisville where Breonna Taylor was murdered, or we're supporting policies and pushing policies that are leading to justice and equity for all. And so I think we should be very clear about whether we're expressing racist ideas, about whether we're supporting racist policies, and admit when we are. Because to be anti-racist is to admit when we expressed a racist idea, is to say, you know what? When I was doing that in Central Park, I was indeed being racist, but I'm going to change. I'm going to strive to be anti-racist. And to be racist is to constantly deny the racial inequities that pervade American society, to constantly deny the racist ideas that pervade American minds. And so I want to build a just and equitable society. And the only way we're going to even begin that process is if we admit our racism and start building an anti-racist world. Thank you.
So the title of this TED Talk is The Difference Between Being Not Racist and Anti-Racist. It is about an hour long, and I highly recommend it if you have the time to go on to YouTube and watch the remainder of this talk as well. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, there's a three-part definition of the word racism. One, it's a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. 2A, a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles. 2B, a political or social system founded on racism. And 3, racial prejudice or discrimination. Typically, when people talk about racism, they're focusing on the third part of this definition, the personal racial prejudice or discrimination. But according to Kendi, personal prejudice is just the tip of the iceberg. It's those first two parts that require the most attention, the belief in the inherent superiority of a particular race and the policies and systems designed to support that belief. To be racist is not merely to have a personal prejudice. It is to endorse the idea of racial hierarchy, to characterize entire groups of people as a problem to be addressed, and to support or tolerate policies and systems designed to perpetuate racial inequality, to perpetuate racial inequality. Most people who speak racist words, display racist behaviors, and embrace racist ideas become immediately defensive when those words, behaviors, and ideas are challenged, because we've come to think of racist as an insult to personal character rather than a description of harmful practices. But to turn the word racist into a slur, says Kendi, is to render it unusable and freeze us into inaction. Imagine telling someone whose finger has just been slammed in a car door that his or her scream is inappropriate. Kendi also challenges the often repeated saying that while Black people may be prejudiced, only white people can be racist, because racism is prejudice plus power, and Black people don't have systemic power. I know I've said that myself more times than I can count. But Kendi doesn't buy it. As he sees it, anyone whose words, behaviors, and ideas allow racist policies and systems to thrive is being racist and must be held accountable. He writes, "This powerless defense shields people of color from charges of racism, even when they are reproducing racist policies and justifying them with the same racist ideas as white people they call racist. The powerless defense shields its believers from the history of white people empowering people of color to oppress people of color, and people of color using their limited power to oppress people of color for their own personal gain. Like every other racist idea, the powerless defense underestimates Black people and overestimates white people. It erases the small amount of Black power and expands the already expansive reach of white power. If we accept the idea that we have no power, we're falling under the sort of mind control that will, in fact, rob us of any power to resist. So this quote reminds me of a quote from writer, civil rights activist, and womanist Alice Walker, whom Kendi quotes in the book, when she says, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." So Kendi writes on page 6 that racist ideas make people of color think less of themselves, which makes them more vulnerable to racist ideas. Racist ideas make white people think more of themselves, which further attracts them to racist ideas. The problem with being not racist. You heard Kendi talk a little bit about this in that 4-minute clip that we started with at the top. What he writes in the book is here on the screen. What's the problem with being not racist? It is a claim that signifies neutrality. I'm not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequalities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequalities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. So one thing that Kendi says in the book as well is that someone who says that they're not racist is really a racist in denial. We're always being either racist or anti-racist. There is no middle ground. So I'm going to pause here and ask, let's start with Zoom. Dedra, do we have any questions or comments so far?
No questions at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Jordana, do you see anything on YouTube yet? I'm sorry, Jordana, you're also on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm on the chat. Not for now. I think people are engrossed.
Okay. And what about on YouTube, Ronnie or Robin?
You can hear me, right?
I
No
can hear you.
question. No question.
Okay. So remember now you have the opportunity to contribute your questions and comments either in Zoom or on YouTube. So just drop those there and we'll pick them up as we go along. So for now, I'll just keep rolling. One of the major premises of how to be an anti-racist is that the history of the racialized world is a three-way fight between assimilationists, segregationists, and anti-racists. So according to Kendi, segregationist ideas and assimilationist ideas are racist ideas. Segregationist ideas spring from a belief in genetic racial distinction and fixed hierarchy. In other words, someone who is being a segregationist believes that one race is inherently and immutably superior to all others. Therefore, that superior race should remain set apart in its own best interest. Assimilationist ideas are rooted in the notion that certain racial groups are culturally or behaviorally inferior. So while assimilationists also believe in a superior race, they believe that the inferior races can be elevated by proximity to and as a result of the consistent influence of the superior race. Assimilationists see the superior race as benevolent saviors of the lowly. According to Kendi, anti-racist ideas are based in the truth that racial groups are equals in all the ways that they are different. Anti-racists respect and accept all people as they are, recognizing that oneness does not require sameness. According to Kendi, it's possible for anyone to be racist in one moment and anti-racist in the next. Being anti-racist is a lifelong endeavor with ebbs and flows. So it's not like you get there and then that's the end. It is a continuing process of monitoring your own thoughts, words, behaviors, attitudes, and the policies and systems that you support.
Tawnicia, we have a question and a comment.
Okay.
Carrie Fight has said there's been some challenging of Kendi's idea that Black folks do have power and thus can be racist. But isn't he just saying that Black people can engage in anti-Black racism without taking away from the idea that there cannot be anti-white racism because there is no systemic power in it? I know he also gets into the idea that Black folks do have collective power evident by history, and this is what is perhaps being challenged. So I'm wondering if what she's asking is if if Black people can engage in anti-Black racism, but not anti-white racism because there's no power.
Well, let me take the first part of that question. So yes, he is saying that Black people can engage in anti-Black racism. And part of that is that when you, and we'll talk about, we're coming to this coming up, but when you are living in a society where you're constantly bombarded with messages of anti-Black racism, sometimes those things seep in and become internalized. And there are people who are motivated by a belief in white supremacy, white superiority, without even recognizing it, Black people. And that's part of what he says it means to be an assimilationist, is to be motivated as a Black person by the idea that we can be empowered by proximity to and adapting the practices of white people. So that's one thing. His focus is really in this book on anti-Black racism. However, he does talk in, I forget which chapter it is, where he's sharing his experiences with anti-white racism as well. And what he says is that when you deny that Black people as a group have any power at all to do anything, that in itself is a form of oppression. And so even though what he says is that Black people collectively have limited power or less power, to say that Black people have no power is to be brainwashed into believing that there is absolutely nothing that we can do? Thank you for that question.
We also have a comment from Dr. Tamika Bradley Hobbs. She said,
Yes.
I appreciate the reframing of Black people and racism that Kendi offers. It is empowering in some ways. It acknowledges progress and it prevents us from being a monolith. It also recognizes that Black people have some level of privilege as well, not the same as whites, but privilege nonetheless.
Yes, thank you for that comment.
Would you like Tamika to make any comments?
You want to take another question?
Okay. I think I would, Dr. Tamika Hobbs is a board member of the South Florida People of Color. I'm wondering if she would like to say anything else to expand on the comments that she just shared with us. So I can't see the chat, but Tamika, would you like to say anything else on that point?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. What a surprise. You're doing a fantastic job. And greetings to everyone who's on the call. Yes, I would have to say that Kendi's framing of that question, I think my understanding of it was similar to what you described, right? This idea that because Black people lacked equal power to whites, that we could not be racist. But in fact, there have been a number of Black people who have enjoyed quite a bit of power and privilege and financial security and have been quite influential. And so what Kendi taught me in this book is that when we say things that like Black people can't be racist, we erase all of this progress that has been made. For example, would we argue that Barack Obama was powerless? I don't think you could say that. He had quite a bit of influence that he used in some profound ways when we think about his appointments of Loretta Lynch and I think what stands out in my mind is Eric Holder as the Attorney General and the work that they were able to do to hold police departments accountable around the nation, to end or really try to address the issue of mass incarceration. That was real power. And so I think we have to, number one, acknowledge that, but then also interrogate the ways that privilege, in our community is multi-layered, and that, we still have the ability to, I guess, number one, within our community, exercise levels of oppression. I think for one example that comes to my mind is the experience of LGBTQI plus people in the Black community. We are not as progressive, I think, there as we could be. And then outside of that, I think, and this really goes back to the root of his point, that everyone is eligible for good and bad behavior. And there's no exception to that if we're really and truly going to be anti-racist. That also means that Black people have the ability to abuse their power and in some situations act in less than equitable ways towards other races when they are empowered. And you think about some majority Black cities or majority Black institutions, sometimes like public education systems, where there are majority Blacks. There is the ability for Black leadership to behave in certain ways towards whites. And so I say all that to say that Kendi has done us a favor, I think, in complicating that understanding.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have to say too, that when I first read that, that was a new way of thinking about anti-Black racism for me. And I had to put that down and walk away and think about that for a minute before I came to a point of understanding and acceptance of that truth. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to move on now to the next slide, which is the problem of dueling consciousness. To be racist or to be anti-racist? That is the question that Kendi poses. And while the answer may seem clear-cut, the execution of the solution is much more complex. The three-way fight that he talked about on that last slide between segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racist ideas has been taking place in individual human consciousness for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. Kendi's theory is that the fight takes different forms depending on one's racial identity. That is, whether one's racial group is perceived as superior or inferior. Borrowing from educator, sociologist, and social rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois's term double consciousness, which refers to the peculiar sensation of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Kendi writes, quote, "What Du Bois termed double consciousness may be more precisely termed dueling consciousness," end quote. Dueling because the competing ideas are occupying the same space, sometimes even at the same time. Du Bois focused on the specific plight of Black Americans. Kendi writes, "The duel within Black consciousness seems to usually be between anti-racist and assimilationist ideas. That is, that even as Black people strive to be intentional about embracing our cultural heritage and traditions, the world in which we live continues to bombard us with the white supremacist idea that the key to progress is to become as close to white as possible." Many of those messages are quite blatant. For example, what Kendi calls civilizer theology is an assimilationist assumption that Black people can be saved by adopting white supremacist religious beliefs. But that's a topic for another day. That can be a whole conversation by itself. The bottom line here is that assimilationist ideas are racist ideas. Black self-reliance was a double-edged sword, Kendi writes. One side was an abhorrence of white supremacy and white paternalism, white rulers and white saviors. On the other, a love of Black rulers and Black saviors, of Black paternalism. On one side was the anti-racist belief that Black people were entirely capable of ruling themselves, of relying on themselves. On the other, the assimilationist idea that Black people should focus on pulling themselves up by their baggy jeans and tight halter tops, getting off crack, street corners, and government handouts, as if these are the things partially holding their incomes down. This dueling consciousness nourished Black pride by insisting that there was nothing wrong with Black people, but it also cultivated shame with its implication that there was something behaviorally wrong with Black people. Well, at least those other Black people. So this is the duel taking place in Black consciousness. But Kendi also points out that white people have their own dueling consciousness between the segregationist and the assimilationist. White assimilationist ideas challenge segregationist ideas that claim people of color are incapable of development, incapable of reaching the superior standard, incapable of becoming white, and therefore fully human. Assimilationists believe that people of color can, in fact, be developed, become fully human, just like white people. So what does it really mean to be anti-racist? One common misconception is that it means that we are not supposed to see, or more accurately, we are not supposed to acknowledge that we see color. I don't see you as Black, I just see you as human, is a popular saying among would-be anti-racists striving to paint a picture of a post-racial world. But according to Kendi, quote, "It is one of the ironies of racism that we must identify racially in order to identify the racial privileges and dangers of being in our bodies," end quote. In a world where Black bodies are perceived as threats and dangerous, and white bodies are perceived as, well, human, to refuse to acknowledge race is to refuse to acknowledge injustice. Kendi writes, "If we stop using racial categories, then we will not be able to identify racist policies. If we cannot identify racist policies, then we cannot challenge racist policies. If we cannot challenge racist policies, then racist power's final solution will be achieved. A world of inequity none of us can see, let alone resist. Terminating racial categories is potentially the last, not the first step in the anti-racist struggle," he writes. He compares racism to stage 4 metastatic cancer, which he also writes about experiencing. And he insists that while the prognosis is dire, it's essential to recognize that we can and must confess that healing is possible. The heartbeat of anti-racism, he says, is confession. And the confession looks something like what's here on the screen. My society has racism. The most serious stage. Racism is likely to kill my society. My society can survive racism against all odds. So I'll stop here to take questions and comments. How are we looking?
I have a few.
Okay.
Keisha King is wondering if Blacks can be racist. Does he argue that Blacks can be segregationists?
That's a good question. Can Blacks be segregationists? Well, let me go back to the slide and look at this definition here. Segregationist ideas spring from a belief in genetic racial distinction and fixed hierarchy. So yes, if a person who is Black has internalized the racist idea that the white race is superior to the Black race, and that in order to protect itself, the white race should isolate itself from the Black race, that would qualify as a segregationist idea.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yannick Doyen asked if you agree with the categorical information cited on being a racist.
Do I agree with the categorical
information cited on being a racist?
Yes, I would have to say that after much contemplation, I do agree with what Kendi is saying. But again, it was a new approach for me, and I think an empowering one, because what it says is that not only are all people responsible for the work of anti-racism, all people are capable of contributing to a certain extent to that work as well.
Okay.
Thank you for those questions.
I have one
very
here, but we could wait if you want to proceed, Anita.
Okay, let's see. Let me take a look at the time here. Let's take one more question.
Okay. Karen McLaughlin, this is in the Zoom chat. She says, could it be argued that the power, and she puts power in quotes, of Black people who exhibit racist behavior or ideas is only power as long as it perpetuates the systems of white superiority. He uses Clarence Thomas as an example in his book of having racist ideas and behaviors, but Thomas plays into the system of white supremacy, and it does not advance Black power in a real way.
Well, one of the things that Kendi says, if I understand the question, one of the things that Kendi says is that there has been a history of white people putting people of color into positions of power, specifically to carry out racist plans, policies, and systems. But that power, the power to be, the power to do, the power to take action is not given by people. So while the position may be given by people, even if the power that you hold is the power to influence the people right in your household, your children, your family, the people in your church, you do have the power. No matter who you are, you have some level of power to do the work of anti-racism. And so it's important not to fall into the trap of believing that you have no power whatsoever. Limited power, perhaps. No power, absolutely not. And with that power, let me add, comes responsibility. Whether you are Black or white. Okay, so let us continue to the concept of intersectionality. So just when we think that we've grasped Kendi's concept of what it means to be anti-racist, he adds 4 more layers to the equation. Because anti-racism isn't solely about confronting racial discrimination. It's about confronting all forms of bigotry everywhere. In the words of writer, Black feminist, and civil rights activist Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So Kendi introduces us to the concept of intersectionality, which is a term coined by legal scholar, civil rights activist, and critical race theorist, Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So when a poor, Black, lesbian, disabled woman talks about oppression, she is speaking from the intersection of multiple forms of oppression rather than only one. This is an important concept, and this is what, when people are talking about adding to the Black Lives Matter movement, the word all Black Lives Matter, meaning that within the category of race, there are people in the Black community who are also dealing with the oppressions of homophobia and other forms of oppression. And that until we can say that everybody's life matters, we're still guilty to a certain extent of being racist, of being oppressive. And what about reverse discrimination? What Kendi says here is that white racists do not want to define racial hierarchy or policies that yield racial inequities as racist, because to do so would be to define their ideas and policies as racist. Instead, they define policies not rigged for white people as racist. Ideas not centering white lives are racist. And what he says here on the screen, on the slide, is the defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. Someone reproducing inequity through permanently assisting an overrepresented racial group into wealth and power is entirely different than someone challenging that inequity by temporarily assisting an underrepresented group into relative wealth and power. So what Kendi is saying here is that racial discrimination in and of itself is not racist. If it is intended to oppress, then it is racist. If it is intended to promote equity, then it is anti-racist. So we're going to look at a couple of illustrations now that demonstrate this point in more detail. These are not in the book, by the way, but I think that they're very helpful in our discussion of this topic. So what's most important to note here as we examine the 4 frames on this slide is what's happening with the tree, which represents policies and systems that govern our lives. Think of each policy or system as its own tree. There might be one for the public school systems. The criminal justice system is another tree. The healthcare system is another. Banking and loans, housing, etc. So let's take a look at what's happening in the first frame here. Note that inequality is defined as unequal access to opportunities. In this first frame, the tree is leaning in the direction of person A. And not only is the tree leaning, it also bears more fruit on the side facing person A. So person A has access to fruit. Person B has no access, is further away from the tree, and there's also less fruit on that side. This is the first frame. The second frame represents equality with a question mark. Evenly distributed tools and access. So what you'll note in the second frame is that the tree continues to lean in the direction of person A, continues to bear more fruit on the side facing person A. However, person A and person B have been provided both with the same tools and assistance, the same height ladder, and the same size bag to collect the fruit. What this means, though, is that person B is still at a disadvantage. Person A has more access to the fruit. In the third frame, we see equity. With equity, custom tools have been provided that identify and address inequality. So again, the tree continues to lean in the direction of person A and bear more fruit on the side facing person A. Keeping this in mind, person B has been provided with a slightly taller ladder. Now person B is able to access the fruit that is on the side facing him. This is what equity looks like. Note, though, that there's still more fruit, more opportunity on the side facing person A. And then finally, in the fourth frame, we have justice. Justice is fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. Note what's happening with the tree in this frame. The tree is now propped so that it is standing straight, anchored on one side, propped on the other. And the fruit is growing evenly on both sides of the tree. Now that the system has been addressed, the tree has been straightened, it is possible for both person A and person B using the same tools to both access the fruit. So I'm going to pause here to see whether we have any questions or comments. Okay, Dedra?
Hi. I have a question that's not directly related to this slide, but it's about colorism, which is quite, Muslima Lewis presented this. Colorism, which is quite prevalent in the Black community and other communities of color, is a form of assimilation. And I think that's a comment rather than a question.
Yes, absolutely. And Kendi does talk about colorism. Thank you for that, that comment, Muslima. Kendi does talk about colorism in the book and as evidence of assimilation, of accepting the idea, as we discussed, that proximity to whiteness is progress, and the various ways that that impacts Black consciousness and Black communities.
Right.
Yes, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, it's very thought-provoking. Elizabeth Winter also wanted to know about, in the segregation discussion, are we talking economic and educational segregation as well as housing and other aspects?
Yes, segregation in all its forms.
Okay.
Kendi is talking about segregation in all of its various forms.
Okay. Thank you. We're done with.
Okay.
Oh, sorry,
Okay.
Dedra.
Thank you. Thank you. Jordana?
Well, I don't know if this is a rhetorical question for the ages, but we'll just put it out there. Can the system be fixed? In other words, I think it's looking at the last slide under justice. And I know it's a huge question, but I'll just put it out there for people to think about.
Yes, yes. And what Kendi says is that if we are to take on the work of anti-racism, we must believe that the system can be fixed, because you can't be cynical, you can't be hopeless and continue this work effectively. So it's imperative that we believe that healing is possible, noting that it won't be easy. It may not even happen in our lifetimes, but that we are responsible for continuing the work if we want to see it come to pass.
And one more comment has come here, which is again a very big topic, maybe not for here, but someone said, Elizabeth Winter said, will someone address the issue of reparations in this context of equity versus justice and how it can best be used?
Okay. Okay. Jordana, before you go, would you like to say anything about that comment? Would you like to
what I will say about that is there have been instances of reparations in smaller settings and to other groups in large amounts. I will say that Asheville, North Carolina, as many people saw, has taken a step to move toward that. I have studied reparations a lot, and I continue to look at reparations in the context of apology and reckoning. And I think that's a topic, a separate topic for another time in another book. But yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I see reparations as falling into this third frame here, part of the custom tools designed to identify and address inequality. And that until we get to the final stage, which is justice, where the system has been fixed, and it is possible for person A and person B, for Black people and white people, to have equal access to tools and opportunities, then reparations needs to be on the table.
I agree with you. And again, just to be clear, to me, reparations is only one part of a whole systemic revolution or undertaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jordana. Okay. Any other questions coming up on YouTube or in Zoom before we move forward?
They are very quiet on YouTube.
Okay.
We do have a comment that I think is germane to our discussion. It's
Okay.
from Joy. It's from Joy Reed. And she says, I'm a white woman married to a Black man for 24 years. We have a Black family and white family. We have Black and white friends. We have coexisted equally and without any racial stress. After George Floyd died and the Black Lives Matter marches began, we started learning much more about Black history, both of us. We did a lot of talking about it, and it was new to both of us. I find that we have grown as a couple and find that one is not more powerful than the other, though I did feel that he had more power through our lives together in the past. I realize this isn't a question exactly, but I wanted to share.
I thank you for that comment. And I think it is definitely relevant to what we're saying here. I was thinking of a quote I'm going to paraphrase about peace. Peace being not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice. You know, sometimes when we don't talk about things, we think that we're in a place of peace. And when we begin to talk about them, we realize that there's a lot more happening under the surface. And so this work of anti-racism is going to stir things up. And we will definitely be uncomfortable before we get to a place of calm. But that's the necessary work. There's a difference between being a peacemaker and being a peacekeeper. Thank you for that comment. Okay. James, you have a comment from YouTube?
From Stephanie in Zoom.
Okay.
Will you mute her and I'll ask?
Okay, yes, go ahead and pose your question, James.
There's a question.
Okay, we have some feedback here. So maybe, James, you can mute yours and you can put the question in the Zoom for someone else to read for us. Thank you.
Yeah.
James is here in the same room with me. Okay, so in the meantime, we will move forward to the next slide. So this slide, which actually is the final slide of the presentation, is an illustration of the Black experience in America from slavery to the present. Of course, there are far more events that took place over the course of this 400+ year span than we can capture here. But this gives you a glimpse of the trajectory. And the key point, the key takeaway here is that for every period of Black progress, you can see that there has been white supremacist retaliation. So let's start with the first section of this arc, which is the period of chattel slavery. From 1619 to 1865, enslaved African people in America were by law deemed less than human. They were property and their lives were at the mercy of their white supremacist owners. It was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read or write. In 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation granted enslaved Africans in the secessionist Confederate States their freedom. Slavery was later abolished throughout the US by the ratification of the 13th Amendment, leading us into the period of Reconstruction. Between 1866 and 1876, the period was known as Reconstruction because Confederate states were engaged in the process of reconstructing their constitutions so they could rejoin the Union. Formerly enslaved Black people enjoyed unprecedented access to the political process at the state level, and there were even 2 Black men elected to the US Senate during Reconstruction. Note that they were men because women did not yet have the right to vote. And it's also important to note here that today there are still only 3 Black US senators. Frustrated, however, by the growing power that now free Black people were wielding, white supremacists in the Confederate States began to devise schemes to suppress and disenfranchise the Black population by voter suppression strategies that included not only the threat of violence, but lynchings and massacres of entire Black towns. And in 1877, the Compromise of 1877 marked the beginning of segregation. And during this period, during this compromise, then President Rutherford Hayes, who was an abolitionist, struck a deal agreeing to remove federal troops from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina and look the other way, while white supremacists manipulated their voting laws to disenfranchise Black voters. Under what was known as the Magnolia Strategy, poll taxes, property and residency qualifications, literacy tests, understanding clauses, criminal disenfranchising statutes, and other things were legalized. And by 1883, there were no Black representatives left in Southern state governments. Between 1882 and 1968, there were 3,446 recorded lynchings of Black people. And I just want to stop here to make a plug for Dr. Tamika Hobbs' book, if you haven't read it, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. You can read a history of the lynchings that took place specifically in this state and learn about some of the massacres that happened as part of disenfranchisement schemes, including in Ocoee in 1920. There was the Tulsa Massacre, or what is known as Black Wall Street in 1921, and Rosewood in 1923. All of these things took place as a method of suppression and disenfranchisement. And then in 1896, the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson codified this idea of separate but equal policies in the context of public accommodations. And that became the law of the land. So all of the legislative achievements that were gained during the period of Reconstruction were erased through the separate but equal doctrine. So again, look at the period, the period of progress during Reconstruction, followed by the erasure of that progress during the period of segregation. Then we move to the Civil Rights Movement, marked by Brown versus the Board of Education, ruling in 1954, which rendered the policy of separate but equal unconstitutional, specifically in the context of public schools. Then we've got in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited legal segregation and discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided for federal oversight and enforcement of voter registration and voting. So again, we have a period where gains are being made. We see increased activity of social civil disobedience and some of the protest marches. And we see in 1968, Martin Luther King is beginning to plan the Poor People's Campaign, which was a call for economic justice for poor people of all races, making the statement that all people should have what they need to live. But of course, as we know, Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. And we move into the Black Power movement, which is a social movement. Again, increased activity of civil disobedience. And once again, the Black Panther Party is taking matters into their own hands by making a demand for and creating the policies or the organizations that will allow for Black businesses to thrive, creating food co-ops, farms, schools, clinics to benefit the Black community. And again, there is white supremacist backlash and retaliation, courtesy of the federal government. We move into the new Jim Crow after the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which launched the war on drugs and resulted in disparities in sentencing for drug use and possession in Black and brown communities. Cocaine versus crack, for example. 5 grams of crack carried a 5-year prison sentence, while 500 grams of powder cocaine carried the same sentence, talking a 100-to-1 ratio. So that, of course, crack cocaine, which was more accessible in Black and brown communities, carried a much heavier sentence. We have President Clinton's Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act during this new Jim Crow period, the Crime Bill of 1994, which resulted in the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, the militarization of police departments, and harsher sentencing. And for more information about what is happening during this new Jim Crow period, I would refer you to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and Ava DuVernay's Netflix documentary, 13th. In 2013, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, we move into the period where we are today, which is now being recognized as the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, advocating for nonviolent civil disobedience and protests against incidents of police brutality against Black people. So as we look at this arc of history, the question really becomes, how much progress have we actually made in our journey to equity and ultimately justice for all people? Any questions or comments? Dedra, do you have anything?
I do, from Laura Genzoa. These slides are very powerful and make a very complex problem easy to understand. How do programs like affirmative action fit into the slides? Do they only provide equity, or can they change the system?
That's a good question. My answer, although this is not what Kendi says, my answer to that would be that programs like affirmative action are, if we go back to that, go back here, fall under the equity frame, custom tools to identify and address inequality. So I think that there is still work to be done in the work of justice. Affirmative action programs are acknowledging that there is a need for equity, but the work of correcting the systems and policies remains to be done. That's not the end, but it is a stopgap measure.
Okay. And Robert Winter asks, does current minimum salary policies impede evolving from equity to justice?
Say that again for me.
Does current minimum salary policies impede evolving from equity to justice?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Let me see. Jordana, I'm just going to ask you if you can you help me understand that question?
I mean, maybe whoever posed it would like to add to it. I'm thinking the way I read it and understood it was if we're talking about poverty and the race, the caste and racist system that's created it and its effect on people, whether keeping salaries low impedes us from moving toward the slide that's called justice. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure exactly what that questioner is asking. So
Okay.
maybe they can pose it again. I did have another comment with a question built in, which I think is really interesting, if you have time for it.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do, yes.
Okay, so Giselle says, with regards to fixing the system, the intent of the system is the issue. Was the system created as a tool of oppression? And if so, can it be fixed if it is really fulfilling its intent, or does it need to be recreated with the intent of justice and order? And I think we've been hearing during this, the rebellion going on now, this idea of burn it to the ground. Someone said they don't care if Target is burnt to the ground, just as an example. And if it is meant, if it's really successfully doing what it's meant to do we fix it or do we destroy it and start something new? So.
Wow, that's a question. And I don't think I think we're going to have a variety of responses to that question. I don't think that everybody is ever going to be on the same page regarding, what the next step should be. Yeah.
And then the question that James put that Stephanie had asked is, does Kendi address the role of socialization in the dual consciousness? The creation of these tensions is so prevalent through media, art, news, written text, magazines, images, music, etc. I'm wondering if it's dual, D-U-A-L consciousness, or the dueling that you talked about in the prior slide.
Okay.
The problem of dueling consciousness. Yeah.
I don't recall Kendi spending a whole lot of time. Someone can correct me if I'm forgetting on the role of socialization. Definitely that it does play a role, and the ideas of white supremacy that are internalized even by Black people are very insidiously, delivered through the media. The question is, I guess what we do to acknowledge that and to combat that. Part of it, I think, is to stop allowing the media to do our thinking for us.
That question that we're unclear on, apparently the poser of the question, we're asking maybe if that person could speak their question. I don't know. Ronnie or Robin?
I'm on?
Oh, there you
Yes.
are, Robert.
Okay, thank you. I live in a condo that contracts for security, maintenance, etc. And the minimum salary of what they get paid is about $10 or $11 an hour. What that causes is that most of those people have to have a second job, have no health insurance or very poor in health insurance. So it defines a population. And I'm wondering what can be done, because I think that the salaries are a root issue that leads into all kinds of consequences.
Well, you know, my first thought about that is that this is exactly the work that Martin Luther King was taking on as he was working to build the Poor People's Campaign just before his assassination in 1968. And it's the work that Bishop William Barber is taking on as he now revitalizes the Poor People's Campaign today, bringing people together for economic justice across the boundaries of race and gender and religion and ethnicity, recognizing that at the end of the day, this is an economic issue. And there is strength in that approach, which is why, as a lot of people have said, Martin Luther King was becoming increasingly perceived as increasingly more of a threat. When we stop focusing on race as something that has to keep us separate and realize that we are ultimately more empowered when we make room for one another's differences and the common work of justice, we are empowered. I do think it's an issue that needs to be addressed. I think I see that Tamika Hobbs is on as well to comment.
Okay, yes. Hello again. I really appreciate your response to Robert's question. And I would add to that, that's what the Fight for 15 has been all about, is raising wages. There was a report that came out recently that said in order to be able to afford housing in South Florida, a person would have to make $29 to $31 per hour. And it's really stunning when you consider the pay rate that Robert just shared. We have a lot of ground to cover. Wages have not kept up with inflation. They have not kept up with a lot of the salaries of people at the top percentages, top percentiles in our society, which deals with it brings us to the wealth gap generally, but the racialization of that wealth gap is going back to that slide that Professor Rowan showed about the the Black progress, the progress towards integration in this country. It's one of the tremendous legacies, and I think for all the reasons that people like to criticize Black Americans and Black culture and Black society, the root of it all is our inability to be able to attain equitable income. And so I think if we solve those questions, we'll be able to move forward a lot. I originally raised my hand to respond to the question, I think that was raised by Sonia, about socialization. And I don't have, I think Professor Rowan targeted that head on, but the one thing that occurs to me in Kendi's books and what I really enjoyed about it was kind of the memoir portion of it, where he describes his own socialization and the way that he had to kind of retrain himself away from, kind of these innate racist bias ideologies that just were part of the environment that he grew up with. In the beginning, he talks about that speech that he gave as a young man, and how ashamed he is of that speech today, but how it really speaks to all the messages that he absorbed as a young person about the value of people. So when I think about socialization, I think he has given us a very powerful and personal example of the way that race and racism can even shape the psyche of a Black person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, for bringing us back to the memoir portion of the book. And something else that comes to mind for me with regard to the stories that he shares about his own life is the point that he continues to drive home about the work of anti-racism requiring a willingness to be wrong sometimes, and to recognize and confess when we are learning something about ourselves that we may not have previously seen before we got engaged in this study and this work. And so just his willingness to be transparent and to share the various stages of his own life, where he's moving back and forth, as he says we all do, between being racist and being anti-racist, is powerful and is an invitation for us to also look at our own lives and see where those patterns may be similar for us. So in conclusion, the work of anti-racism truly is to name, to confess, and to confront racism. So the question that I would like to leave with all of us today is, what steps will you personally take in striving to be anti-racist? How will you check yourself and hold yourself accountable if you notice that you or someone else within your sphere of influence, whatever that is being racist? This is what Kendi invites us to ask ourselves. This is what I am inviting you to go away with today, to think about where you are on the journey, places where you may have been racist at times, places where you are definitively anti-racist, and what it will take to be, at the very least, more anti-racist than racist on your daily journey.
I'm wondering if you have time for another observation and question.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is from Deanne Connolly Graham. And she says, affirmative action has not really helped education because academia has a very low percentage of Black faculty in their top universities and colleges. Additionally, most HBCUs rely on white donors, so they tend to turn out graduates who are not interested in challenging systemic racism or uplift other Blacks. Graduates invariably go into finance, medicine, and law, but rarely work to change policy to eliminate systemic racism. How can we affect real change when many of our educated Black elite don't show any real interest in changing the status quo at its root?
Wow. Okay. I am going to invite some people to join me to respond to that question. I'd like to ask Tamika Hobbs to come back in if you're still with us.
Yes,
Okay.
and thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I think, that's a complex question. I'm a graduate of a HBCU, Florida A&M University. I've been working at Florida Memorial University for quite some time now. And I spent a year away, my first time working at a PWI last year. And I think there's a lot of validity in some of what Ms. Connolly points out. I think that there definitely is unequal terrain. And again, we can't divorce any of this from history. We had to found, African Americans had to found our institutions on our own, and, with little or nothing. And then actually, I should say, in collaboration with whites, there was a lot of white support in the period after emancipation to bring these schools into fruition. But they have been kept alive by the blood, sweat, and tears of Black folks because we were largely excluded from the predominantly white institutions, traditionally white institution by law. And that also goes into the funding question, and the unequal growth over centuries, in some cases, between these institutions. And then when you talk about desegregation and now Blacks having the ability to attend white schools, we've seen a tremendous decrease in enrollment in HBCUs since the 1970s. For me, I think a lot of that does play into the psychology of racism and the internalized racism within the race, that we believe that we have to go somewhere else to receive a better education. I am one, my ethics are such that I believe that we should be building our own institutions for the benefit of our folks. And so HBCUs and making those investments are there. The only thing I would push back a little bit against in the comment is the idea that Black schools receive the majority of their funding from whites. And I don't know that that is completely true. It's not true for Florida Memorial University. That's the only institution I really can speak of. But I am an alumnus of Florida A&M University, and they have a very robust donation system and support from their alumni. So I think that may need to be weighed against some more investigation in terms of that claim. I would like to just share, when we talk about the leadership and the future of HBCUs, in the coming weeks, we're going to be sharing more information about the establishment of a social justice institute at Florida Memorial University. We just issued our first media release around that effort. And I'm very excited for what that means for South Florida, and for the ability of Florida Memorial University to assume a leadership role in combating inequity in our South Florida community.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know, the reason that I asked Dr. Tamika Hobbs to come back and respond to that particular question is because she's the Associate Provost at Florida Memorial University. So we look forward to hearing more about what is in store there. So thank you all so much. I hope that this conversation has been helpful. I hope it has been enjoyable. I hope that you will save the date for November 14th, 2020 at 1 p.m. to join us for our next book talk, and that you will stay tuned for the announcement of our next book selection. I'd also like to invite you to use the QR code on the screen to complete a quick survey about today's event. And you should also receive an email correspondence from us giving you access to that survey as well. So again, I would like to thank everyone for participating in today's conversation. And I look forward to having you with us again in November. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.